It was the kind of Saturday afternoon that smelled like cut grass and summer vacation. The kind of day parents remember later, when they're trying to piece together how everything went so wrong. Rachel Hartley stood at her kitchen sink, folding a basket of towels still warm from the dryer. The windows were open. A breeze moved through the house, carrying with it the distant sound of a lawnmower and the occasional bark of a dog 2 streets over. Through the screen door, Rachel could see her daughter in the front yard. Emma was 7 years old, small for her age, with light brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She was on her knees in the driveway, drawing something with sidewalk, chalk, purple and yellow flowers, maybe, or a rainbow. Rachel didn't look closely. She didn't need to. Emma was right there 15 feet away, humming to herself in that absent, tuneless way children do when they're lost in their own little world. Rachel had checked on her twice already in the last 10 minutes. It was instinct. A glance through the door, a quick scan of the yard, and back to the laundry. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. At 2:47 p.m., Rachel looked out again. She saw Emma's pink sneakers at the edge of the driveway, toes pointed toward the street. The chalk was still scattered on the concrete. Emma's juice box sat on the porch step, condensation beating on the cardboard. Rachel turned back to the towels. 5 minutes later, she looked again. The sneakers were still there. The chalk was still there. But Emma was not. Rachel froze. Her hands went still on the towel she was folding. She stared through the screen door, her brain working slowly, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, or what she wasn't seeing. She told herself, Emma had gone around the side of the house. Or maybe she'd run next door to see the neighbor's cat. Kids did that. They wandered. They got distracted. But something in Rachel's chest tightened. She dropped the towel and walked to the door. Then she pushed it open and stepped onto the porch. The heat of the afternoon hit her face. The street was quiet, empty. Emma? Her voice came out flat. Not worried yet. Just questioning. No answer. Emma, honey, where are you? Still nothing. Rachel walked down the porch steps, barefoot, her heart starting to pick up speed. She moved into the driveway, her eyes scanning the yard, the sidewalk, the street. She looked toward the neighbor's house. She looked toward the corner. She called Emma's name again, louder this time. Silence. And then something inside Rachel broke open. The calm shattered. She started running. She ran into the street, her voice rising, cracking, turning into something she didn't recognize. She screamed Emma's name. She screamed it again and again, her bare feet slapping against the pavement, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Doors started opening. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches, squinting into the sunlight, confused. Mrs. Brennan from across the street came hurrying over, her hands still wet from washing dishes. Mr. Kowalski, an older man who lived 2 houses down, walked into the street with his cane. What's wrong? Mrs. Brennan asked, her voice tight with alarm. Emma? Rachel gasped. She's gone. She was right there. She was right there and now she's gone. Within minutes, the entire block had emptied. People were moving through yards, calling Emma's name, checking behind bushes, looking under porches. Someone ran to the park 3 blocks away. Someone else checked the creek behind the elementary school. The search spread like a ripple, fast and frantic, fueled by adrenaline and the shared, unspoken fear that something terrible had happened. At 3:15 p.m., someone called 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, practiced. She asked for a description. Rachel could barely speak. She kept saying the same things over and over. 7 years old, light brown hair, pink shirt, pink sneakers. She was right there. She was right there. The first police car arrived at 3:22 p.m., then another. By 3:45, there were 6 patrol vehicles parked along the street, their lights flashing red and blue against the white siding of the houses. Officers moved through the neighborhood in pairs, knocking on doors, asking questions, taking notes. They searched the Hartley house top to bottom, closets, basement, garage. They searched the backyard, the shed, the neighbors' properties. Emma's father, Tom Hartley, had been at work when it happened. He was a shift supervisor at a manufacturing plant 40 minutes away. When the call came through, he didn't ask questions. He just left. He drove home with his hands locked on the steering wheel, his mind blank with terror. When he pulled onto his street and saw the police cars, the neighbors standing in clusters, Rachel sitting on the porch steps with her face in her hands, he knew. He knew before anyone said a word. By 4:30 p.m., the search had expanded beyond the neighborhood. Police brought in a canine unit. The dog picked up Emma's scent in the driveway, followed it to the sidewalk, and then stopped at the curb. The handler said the trail went cold. That meant one thing. Emma hadn't wandered off. She'd been taken. Someone had put her in a vehicle and driven away. The word abduction wasn't used yet. Not officially, but everyone was thinking it. By 6 p.m., the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. The search parties were still out, combing through the woods at the edge of town, checking abandoned buildings, knocking on doors miles away from the Hartley house. Rachel sat at her kitchen table, staring at nothing, while a detective named Alan Marsh asked her the same questions over and over. What time did you last see Emma? Did you see anyone on the street? Any cars you didn't recognize? Anyone acting strange? Rachel answered in a monotone. She couldn't cry anymore. She felt hollow. Tom sat beside her, his jaw clenched, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles were white. He kept asking what he could do. The detective told him to stay calm, stay available, and let them work. But Tom couldn't sit still. Every few minutes, he stood up and paced, then sat back down again. He felt useless, helpless. By 8 p.m., Emma's face was on the local news, a school photo from earlier that year. She was smiling, missing one of her front teeth. The anchor's voice was somber as she read the details. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, 7 years old, last seen at 2:47 p.m. If you have any information, please call the number on your screen. Tips started coming in almost immediately. People calling to say they'd seen a suspicious van, a man lurking near the park, a car driving too slowly down a residential street. The police followed up on every single one. Most led nowhere. By midnight, the search had slowed. Volunteers were sent home. The streets went quiet again, but the fear stayed. It hung in the air like smoke. Parents locked their doors. They checked on their children in the middle of the night. They looked out their windows and wondered who among them had done this. Because in a town of 1,847 people, where everyone knew everyone, someone had to know something. Rachel Hartley didn't sleep that night. She sat on Emma's bed, holding one of her stuffed animals, staring at the walls covered in crayon drawings. She kept replaying the afternoon in her head, over and over, searching for the moment she missed, the moment she could have stopped it, the moment she should have been watching. And in the back of her mind, a question formed, one she couldn't push away no matter how hard she tried. Was Emma still alive? The clock was ticking, and everyone involved knew it. In missing child cases, the first 48 hours are everything. After that, the statistics get darker. The chances drop. The outcomes become harder to talk about. By Sunday morning, less than 24 hours after Emma Hartley disappeared, the investigation had already expanded beyond anything Millbrook had ever seen. The FBI arrived just after dawn, 3 agents in dark suits who set up a command post in the high school gymnasium. Local police were still canvassing the neighborhood, but now they had federal support resources, databases, behavioral analysts who specialized in child abduction cases. Detective Alan Marsh hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled, but he moved with purpose. He'd worked missing person cases before, but never a child, never in a town this small, never with this kind of pressure. The phone lines were ringing constantly, tips were flooding in, and so far, none of them had led anywhere. The search dogs had been brought in Saturday evening. 2 German shepherds, trained in cadaver detection and live tracking. They'd started in the Hartley's front yard, where Emma had last been seen. The lead dog, a female named Sadie, picked up the scent immediately. She moved from the driveway to the sidewalk, nose low to the ground, her and handler following close behind. She tracked Emma's scent down the street, past 3 houses, past the Kowalski's mailbox, past the elm tree where kids sometimes tied their bikes, and then she stopped. She circled near the curb, sniffing the pavement, the grass, the edge of a drainage ditch that ran along the road. She whined, Frustrated, her handler gave her more time, but the result didn't change. The scent ended there. Just stopped, like Emma had evaporated into the air. The handler looked at Detective Marsh and shook his head. That meant one thing. Emma had been put into a vehicle. Whoever took her had parked right there, maybe for less than a minute, and then driven away. It was fast. It was planned. And it was done in broad daylight on a quiet residential street. By Sunday afternoon, detectives had interviewed every single person within a half-mile radius of the Hartley home. They knocked on doors, asked the same questions, took notes, and looked for inconsistencies. Did you see anything unusual on Saturday? Any cars you didn't recognize? Anyone walking through the neighborhood who didn't belong? The answers were all the same. No, nothing. It was just a normal Saturday. Mrs. Callahan, an elderly woman who lived directly across the street from the Hartleys, told investigators she'd been in her kitchen around 2:50 p.m. when she heard a car door slam. She hadn't looked out the window. She said car doors slammed all the time in the neighborhood, people coming home, leaving for errands, picking up kids. It didn't stand out to her. She didn't see the car. She didn't know if it was even related, but the timing fit, 2:50 p.m. 3 minutes after Rachel last saw Emma, detectives pressed her for more details. Was it a heavy door? Light? Did it sound like a truck or a sedan? Was there an engine noise afterward? Mrs. Callahan couldn't say. She hadn't been paying attention. She wished she had. She said that over and over. She wished she'd looked. She wished she'd seen something. But she hadn't. The Hartley home was searched again on Sunday, this time more thoroughly. FBI agents went through every room, every closet, every drawer. They checked the attic, the basement, the crawl space under the back porch. They weren't looking for Emma, not really. They were looking for evidence, anything that might suggest the family was involved. It was standard procedure, and Tom and Rachel understood that, but it didn't make it any easier. They stood in the driveway while strangers went through their daughter's bedroom, their private lives laid bare for inspection. Tom Hartley answered every question the detectives asked. He provided his work schedule, his phone records, the names of his co-workers. He'd been at the plant all day Saturday, clocked in at 7 a.m., didn't leave until the call came through at 3:18 p.m. Dozens of people could confirm it. His alibi was airtight. Rachel's alibi was less clear, but only because she'd been home alone. She'd folded laundry, checked on Emma, made lunch, watched part of a talk show on TV. There was no one to corroborate her story except Emma, and Emma was gone. Rachel knew how it looked. She knew she was a suspect, even if no one said it out loud. So when the FBI asked her to take a polygraph test, she agreed immediately. She wanted to. She needed them to know she had nothing to hide. Tom took one too. They both sat in separate rooms at the police station on Monday morning, wired to machines that measured their heartbeats, their breathing, their sweat response. The examiner asked them questions in flat, emotionless tones. Did you harm your daughter? Do you know where your daughter is? Are you involved in your daughter's disappearance? Both of them passed. No deception indicated. The results didn't clear them entirely. Polygraphs weren't perfect, and investigators knew that, but it shifted the focus outward. If the parents weren't involved, then someone else was. Someone in the neighborhood. Someone close. Volunteer search parties went out every day. Hundreds of people combed through the woods on the edge of town, checked drainage ditches, looked through abandoned barns and sheds. They put up flyers on every telephone pole, every storefront, every bulletin board within 50 miles. Emma's face was everywhere. The local news ran updates every night. The story started getting picked up by regional stations, then national ones. People across the state were talking about the little girl who vanished from her front yard, but no one had seen her. No one had any answers. By Tuesday, frustration was setting in. Detectives were following up on dozens of tips, but most of them were dead ends. Someone called in saying they saw a white van near the elementary school. Investigators tracked it down. It belonged to a plumber who'd been working on a job 3 miles away. Someone else reported a suspicious man at a gas station. Turned out to be a truck driver passing through who had nothing to do with Millbrook. Every lead fizzled. Every door closed. And then there was Dale Puit. He lived 3 houses down from the Hartleys. in a small ranch-style home with peeling paint and overgrown hedges. He was 53 years old, unmarried, no kids. He worked part-time at a hardware store and kept to himself. People in the neighborhood knew him, but not well. He didn't go to block parties. He didn't chat with neighbors. He mowed his lawn and went inside. When detectives knocked on his door Sunday afternoon, he answered in a stained t-shirt and jeans, blinking in the sunlight like he hadn't been outside in days. They asked him the same questions they'd asked everyone else. "Were you home on Saturday? Did you see anything unusual?" Puit said he'd been home all day. He'd been working on a project in his garage. He hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anything. He seemed nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot, not making eye contact. One of the detectives asked if they could take a look around his property, just to rule things out. Puit stiffened. He said no, not without a warrant. That raised a flag. Most people cooperated. Most people wanted to help. But Puit shut the door and went back inside. Detectives started looking into him more closely. They pulled his criminal record. It was clean, no arrests, no charges, not even a traffic ticket. They talked to his co-workers at the hardware store. Everyone said the same thing. He was quiet, kept to himself, did his job, and went home. No one knew much about him. No one had ever been inside his house. They talked to his neighbors. Mrs. Brennan said Puit had always been a little odd. He didn't wave back when you waved at him. He stared sometimes. She'd caught him looking out his window late at night more than once. But that didn't mean anything, did it? People were allowed to be strange. Being strange wasn't a crime. Still, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Puit's refusal to let them search his property stuck with them. His weak alibi alone in his garage. No one to confirm it stuck with them. His nervous demeanor stuck with them. On Wednesday, they went back to his house with a warrant. Puit answered the door again, but this time his face was tight, angry. He didn't say anything. He just stepped aside and let them in. The search took 3 hours. Detectives went through every room, every drawer, every corner of the house. They checked the garage, the shed in the backyard, the crawl space under the house. They were looking for anything evidence of Emma, signs of a struggle, something that didn't belong. They found nothing. No Emma, no clothes, no blood, no signs that a child had ever been there. Puit's house was cluttered but not suspicious. Old newspapers stacked in the corner, tools scattered on a workbench, a half-finished woodworking project in the garage. It was the house of a lonely, eccentric man. Nothing more. But the suspicion didn't go away. It lingered. Detectives kept Puit on their list. They kept watching him, because in a case like this, when there were no leads and no witnesses and no evidence, you had to look at everyone. And sometimes, the person who looked the most out of place was exactly the person you needed to watch. By the end of the first week, the investigation had stalled. Emma Hartley was still missing, and no one had any idea where she was. Bringing you this story required weeks of research, cross-referencing records, and verifying every painful detail. If this case moved you, or if you believe these stories need to be heard, please subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your support is what keeps us going and helps us uncover more truths that have been buried for far too long. Now, let's get back to the case. The initial surge of urgency that had gripped Millbrook in those first desperate days began to fade as summer gave way to fall. The command post in the high school gymnasium was dismantled. The FBI agents went back to their field offices. The news vans packed up and left. Emma Hartley's face still hung on telephone poles around town, but the paper had started to curl at the edges, the ink fading in the sun. By August, 3 months after Emma disappeared, the investigation had narrowed to a single focus: Dale Puit. It started with the cadaver dogs. In late July, investigators brought in a specialized K9 unit trained to detect the scent of human remains. They'd been working their way through properties near the Hartley home, checking yards, sheds, wooded areas anywhere a body might be hidden. When they reached Puit's house, one of the dogs alerted near the property line, close to a patch of disturbed soil along the back fence. The handler called it in immediately. Detectives arrived within the hour. They cordoned off the area and brought in a forensic team. The soil was carefully excavated, sifted, examined. They dug 3 feet down, then 4. They brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan for anomalies beneath the surface. They found nothing. No body, no bones, no fabric, no evidence that anything had been buried there at all. The handler explained that cadaver dogs sometimes alerted to old animal remains, decomposed wildlife, even certain types of fertilizer. It wasn't an exact science, but the damage was done. Dale Puit's name was now permanently linked to Emma Hartley's disappearance, and in the eyes of the community, he was guilty. Detectives obtained another search warrant. This time, they tore his house apart. They pulled up sections of the carpet, checked under the floorboards, dismantled the plumbing to look for traces of blood. They seized his computer, his phone records, his car. Forensic technicians went over every inch of his garage with luminol, looking for biological evidence that had been cleaned up. Again, they found nothing. No DNA, no hair fibers, no signs that Emma had ever been inside Puit's home or vehicle. His computer history was unremarkable: news websites, hardware store catalogs, a few forums about woodworking. There was nothing illegal, nothing suspicious, nothing that would give investigators grounds to arrest him. But Puit knew what was happening. He knew how it looked. He knew that even without evidence, people had made up their minds. When detectives showed up at his door for the 3rd time, asking to interview him again, he told them he was done talking. He'd hired a lawyer, a public defender from the county seat, who advised him to stop cooperating. Puit followed that advice. He stopped answering questions. He stopped opening his door. He stayed inside, curtains drawn, while the town turned against him. With Puit uncooperative and no physical evidence to work with, investigators were forced to explore other theories. Maybe it wasn't someone from the neighborhood. Maybe it was a drifter. Someone passing through Millbrook who saw an opportunity and took it. Detectives pulled records of sex offenders within a 100-mile radius. They cross-referenced names with traffic stops, gas station receipts, anything that might place a suspect in the area on June 14th. Nothing matched. Another theory surfaced: a custody dispute. Sometimes abductions were committed by non-custodial parents or estranged family members. But Tom and Rachel had never been separated. They'd been married for 9 years. No history of domestic incidents. No custody battles. Both sets of grandparents had been interviewed and cleared. There was no one in the family with a motive. Then there was the possibility that no one wanted to say out loud. That Emma hadn't been taken at all. That she'd wandered off, maybe following a stray dog, maybe chasing a butterfly and gotten lost in the woods. That she'd fallen into the creek that ran behind the elementary school and drowned. That her body was out there somewhere, hidden by nature instead of intent. Divers were brought in to search the creek. They worked in teams, moving methodically through the cold, murky water, checking under rocks, dragging the deeper pools. They searched for 2 days. They found old tires, rusted shopping carts, a bicycle frame half buried in silt. They didn't find Emma. By December 2003, 6 months after Emma disappeared, the case was still open but barely moving. The tips had slowed to a trickle. Detectives were following up on fewer than 3 leads a week, and most of those were from people calling in years-old hunches or dreams they'd had. The volunteer search parties had stopped. The flyers had been taken down or covered over by newer posters for lost pets and yard sales. On December 9th, Emma's 8th birthday, Rachel and Tom Hartley held a candlelight vigil in the town square. About 70 people showed up, mostly neighbors and friends, holding candles in the cold while Rachel stood at a small podium and tried to speak. She made it through 2 sentences before her voice broke. Tom took over, reading from a prepared statement, asking anyone with information to come forward. His hands shook as he held the paper. The vigil lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, people hugged the Hartleys and went home. Life continued. Rachel wasn't sleeping. She'd lost weight 15 pounds, then 20. She sat in Emma's room for hours at a time, not moving, not speaking, just staring at the stuffed animals lined up on the bed. Her therapist diagnosed her with severe clinical depression and prescribed medication, but Rachel barely took it. She said it made her feel numb, and she didn't want to feel numb. She wanted to feel everything. Because if she stopped feeling, it meant she'd given up. And she couldn't give up. Not on Emma. Tom dealt with it differently. He couldn't sit still. He couldn't be in the house. He threw himself into advocacy, into keeping Emma's name in the public eye. He appeared on local news programs, then regional ones. He reached out to true crime shows, national networks, anyone who would listen. He did interviews for podcasts, wrote letters to journalists, posted updates on early internet forums dedicated to missing children. He needed to believe that someone, somewhere, knew something. That if he just kept talking, kept pushing, the right person would see Emma's face and remember. Maybe they'd seen her in a gas station. Maybe they'd passed a car on the highway and noticed a little girl in the back seat who looked scared. Maybe they hadn't thought it mattered at the time, but now, seeing the story again, they'd realize it did. Tom needed to believe that Emma was still out there, because the alternative was unbearable. The town, slowly and quietly, began to move on. People stopped bringing it up in conversation. The Hartley house stopped getting casseroles and sympathy cards. Parents still watched their kids a little more closely, but the acute fear had dulled. Life had to go on. Bills had to be paid. Kids had to go to wake school. The world kept turning, even when it felt like it shouldn't. But Dale Puit couldn't move on. He was trapped, even without charges, even without evidence. He'd been convicted in the court of public opinion. His neighbors wouldn't look at him. When he went to the grocery store, people whispered. When he walked to his mailbox, cars slowed down and stared. Someone spray-painted "Child Killer" on his garage door in red letters 3 feet tall. His front windows were smashed twice in the same month. He reported it to the police, but they didn't seem particularly motivated to investigate. Puit started getting phone calls in the middle of the night. Heavy breathing. Threats. Someone told him they were going to burn his house down with him inside. Someone else said they knew where he worked, and they were coming for him. Puit stopped answering the phone. He stopped going outside unless he had to. In March 2005, nearly 2 years after Emma disappeared, Dale Puit moved away. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't say goodbye. He packed his things into a U-Haul in the middle of the night and left. By morning, his house was empty. Some people in Millbrook said it was proof he was guilty. Innocent people didn't run, but others pointed out that he hadn't been charged with anything. He hadn't been arrested. He'd just been a man who lived in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the town had destroyed him for it. Either way, he was gone. By 2007, 4 years after Emma Hartley vanished, the case had gone cold. Detective Alan Marsh had retired. The FBI had moved on to other cases. The file sat in a storage room at the police station, boxed up with dozens of others, gathering dust. Officially, the case was still open. Technically, it could be reopened at any time if new evidence surfaced. But no new evidence surfaced. Emma Hartley was gone, and no one knew where. No one knew why. No one knew if she was still alive, or if she'd been dead since the day she disappeared. The Hartleys were left with nothing but questions and the awful, endless waiting. Rachel stopped leaving the house. Tom kept doing interviews, but fewer people called. The story had been told. There was nothing new to say. Millbrook went back to being a quiet town. Population 1,847. A place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Except it had. And everyone knew it. And no one could forget it, no matter how hard they tried. 20 years passed. Emma Hartley's case faded from the headlines, buried under newer tragedies, fresher mysteries. The flyers came down. The vigils stopped. Millbrook kept growing, slowly, the way small towns do. New families moved in, old ones moved away. The house where Emma used to live changed hands twice. The Hartleys had left in 2009, unable to stay in a place that held so much pain. Rachel moved to Ohio to be near her sister. Tom stayed in Pennsylvania, eventually remarried, tried to build something that looked like a normal life. But Emma never left them. Not really. And then, in the summer of 2023, everything changed. Pennsylvania was suffering through one of the worst droughts in recorded history. Temperatures had been over 90 degrees for weeks. Rivers dropped to half their normal levels. Reservoir warnings were issued across the state. In rural areas, private wells started running dry. Farmers watched their crops wither. Homeowners rationed showers and stopped watering their lawns. In Millbrook, an elderly woman named Iris Wendell was dealing with the same problem. She was 71 years old, lived alone in a modest ranch house on the east side of town. She'd bought the place back in 2006, got a good deal on it because the previous owner had left in a hurry, and the property had been sitting empty for over a year. The house needed work, but Iris didn't mind. She'd fixed it up, planted a garden, made it home. By early July, her well had slowed to a trickle. By mid-July, it stopped completely. No water came out when she turned on the taps. Nothing. Iris called a well service company based in the next county over. They told her they were backed up with calls, everyone's wells were failing, but they'd get someone out to her by the end of the week. On July 18th, a technician named Kevin Marsh arrived at her house just after noon. He was 38 years old, stocky, sunburned, wearing a company shirt and work boots caked in mud. He'd been doing this job for 15 years. He'd seen it all: collapsed casings, rusted pumps, wells that had been dug 100 years ago and were finally giving out. He walked around to Iris's backyard, where the well was located. It was an old stone well, the kind they didn't build anymore, probably dating back to the 1922 or earlier. The opening was covered with a rotting wooden cap and a layer of chicken wire to keep animals out. Kevin removed the cover and looked down. The shaft was dark, narrow, lined with stacked stone that had shifted over the decades. He couldn't see at the bottom. He set up his equipment, a small waterproof camera attached to a cable, with a light mounted on the front. He lowered it slowly, watching the feed on a handheld monitor. The camera descended through the darkness, the walls of the well sliding past, slick with moss and mineral deposits. At 20 feet, the light caught the glint of water pooled at the edges. At 30 feet, the well opened up slightly, the stones more uneven. At 40 feet, the camera stopped moving. Kevin had hit something. He adjusted the angle, trying to see what was blocking the way. The screen showed fabric, dark, rotted, tangled around stones at the bottom of the well. It looked like canvas, maybe a tarp, half buried in mud and debris. Kevin frowned. People dumped all kinds of junk down old wells, trash, construction waste, things they didn't want to deal with. But something about this felt off. He pulled the camera up a few feet and lowered it again, trying to get a better angle. The fabric shifted, slightly, and then he saw it. A shape, small, wrapped in the tarp, and next to it, wedged between two rocks, something pink. Kevin's stomach dropped. He stared at the monitor, his hand suddenly shaking. He'd been doing this job for 15 years. He knew what he was looking at. He pulled the camera up, disconnected it, and walked back to his truck. He didn't say anything to Iris. He just got in, closed the door, and called 911. Within 2 hours, the property was swarmed. Police cars blocked the street. Yellow tape went up around the yard. Forensic teams arrived in white vans, carrying equipment in heavy cases. Iris Wendell stood on her front porch, confused and terrified, watching strangers take over her property. No one would tell her what was happening. They just kept asking her questions. How long have you lived here? Who owned the house before you? Have you ever been down in the well? By late afternoon, a crane had been brought in. The well was too narrow and too unstable to send someone down safely, so they had to extract the contents carefully, piece by piece. A forensic archaeologist supervised the operation, directing the team as they lowered cables and a harness system into the shaft. It took hours. The sun was setting by the time they brought up the first piece of evidence, a section of rotted canvas tarp, black with age and moisture. Then another section. Then, something smaller, fragile, wrapped in layers of decomposed fabric. Human remains. A child's skeleton. Small, delicate, the bones darkened by time and water. They were carefully placed into evidence bags, tagged, photographed, and then, 43 feet down, wedged between two stones near the bottom, they found a child's sneaker. Pink, faded and rotted, but still recognizable. The investigators went silent. One of them, A state police sergeant named Linda Ortiz had been working in the area for over a decade. She remembered the Emma Hartley case. Everyone in Millbrook did, even if they didn't talk about it anymore. She looked at the sneaker, then at the house, then at the property records on her phone. The address matched. This was Dale Puit's old house. The FBI was contacted immediately. By midnight, federal agents were on site. The remains were transported to the state forensic lab in Harrisburg under heavy security. The media got wind of the story by morning. News vans returned to Millbrook for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Reporters stood outside Iris Wendell's house, speculating, asking questions that no one could answer yet. Rachel Hartley was notified on July 19th, just after 9 a.m. She was living in a small apartment outside Cleveland, working part-time at a library, trying to live a quiet life. 2 FBI agents knocked on her door. She knew the moment she saw them. She knew before they said a word. They told her remains had been found in Millbrook, a child. They believed it might be Emma, but they needed DNA confirmation. They needed her to come in and provide a sample for comparison. Rachel didn't remember what she said. She didn't remember sitting down. She just remembered the sound that came out of her, something between a scream and a sob, and the way the floor seemed to tilt under her feet. Tom Hartley got the call an hour later. He was living in Scranton, remarried, working as a sales manager for a logistics company. His second wife, Angela, was the one who answered the phone. She handed it to him, her face pale. Tom listened to the FBI agent on the other end, his hand gripping the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. When the call ended, he sat down on the couch and didn't move for 10 minutes. Then he got in his car and drove to Millbrook. The forensic analysis took 2 weeks. DNA extraction from skeletal remains that had been submerged in water for 20 years was complicated. The bones were degraded, contaminated by soil and minerals. But the lab worked carefully, methodically, extracting mitochondrial DNA from the femur and comparing it to samples provided by Rachel Hartley. The media coverage was relentless. Every true crime podcast, every news outlet, every online forum was talking about Emma Hartley again. Theories exploded across social media. People who'd lived in Millbrook in 2003 were interviewed. Dale Puit's name came up again and again, even though he'd been gone for 18 years and no one knew where he was. Rachel stayed in Ohio, unable to return to Millbrook. She couldn't face it. She couldn't go back to that town, couldn't stand in front of cameras, couldn't answer questions. She waited by her phone, barely eating, barely sleeping, trapped in the same awful limbo she'd been in for 20 years. Tom did go back. He stayed in a motel on the edge of town and met with investigators every day. They walked him through what they knew, what they didn't know, what they were still trying to piece together. He asked if Emma had suffered. They couldn't tell him. They said the remains were too degraded to determine cause of death. That was supposed to be comforting, but it wasn't. On August 2nd, 2023, the DNA results came back. The FBI called Rachel first, then Tom. The remains found in the well behind 427 Oakwood Drive in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, were confirmed to be those of Emma Marie Hartley, age 7, at time of death. Missing since June 14, 2003. Rachel collapsed. Her sister caught her before she hit the floor. Tom sat in his motel room, staring at the wall, the phone still in his hand. After 20 years of not knowing, of hoping against hope that maybe Emma was out there somewhere, alive, living under a different name, too scared or too confused to come home after 20 years of that desperate, irrational hope it was over. Emma was dead. She'd been dead the whole time, and she'd been less than 300 feet from her own house. The discovery of Emma Hartley's remains didn't just reopen the case, it ignited it. Within days of the DNA confirmation, the investigation was handed back to the FBI, working in coordination with Pennsylvania State Police and a new generation of detectives who hadn't been around in 2003. The well on Oakwood Drive became an active crime scene again. Forensic teams cordoned off the entire backyard, set up lights, and began the meticulous process of documenting everything. The remains had been sent to the Forensic Anthropology Unit at the state lab. Dr. Maya Chandra, a specialist in skeletal trauma analysis, led the examination. She'd worked on cold cases before, But this one carried weight. Everyone in the lab knew the name Emma Hartley. Everyone remembered the story. Dr. Chandra's report took 3 days to complete. It confirmed what they already knew: the remains belonged to a child, approximately 7 years old at time of death, consistent with Emma's age and physical description. But it revealed something more. There were fractures, multiple fractures to the ribs, the left arm, and most significantly, a depressed fracture to the back of the skull, the kind of injury caused by blunt force trauma. The report stated that the pattern of fractures was consistent with a fall, possibly into the well itself, where the body could have struck the stone walls on the way down. But the skull fracture told a different story. It was localized, concentrated, the kind of impact that suggested a direct blow or a collision with a hard, angular surface. Dr. Chandra noted in her report that the injury would have caused significant bleeding and likely rendered Emma unconscious immediately. Death would have followed within minutes, possibly faster if the fall into the well caused additional trauma. The well itself was re-examined. Forensic engineers measured its depth, its width, the condition of the stonework. They documented the placement of every rock at the bottom, cross-referenced it with the position of the remains. They also looked at the wooden cover that had been in place in 2003. Iris Wendell still had the old rotted boards in her shed. She'd replaced them years ago but never thrown them out. Investigators retrieved them and examined them in the lab. The boards were old, brittle, half-eaten by termites and rot. In 2003, they would have been even weaker. It would have taken almost no effort to remove them. A child could have done it. But more importantly, an adult could have removed them, dropped something or someone down the well, and put them back in place without leaving obvious evidence. Then investigators found something else. Buried in the case files from 2003, in a stack of interview transcripts and evidence logs that had been boxed up for 20 years, was a detail that had been noted but never followed up on. During the initial investigation, Dale Puit had told detectives he'd been working on his yard the week Emma disappeared. Landscaping, he'd said. Fixing up the backyard. A receipt from a local hardware store, dated June 12, 2003, showed that Puit had purchased 50 pounds of topsoil, gravel, and a roll of heavy-duty plastic sheeting. At the time, it hadn't seemed significant. People bought landscaping supplies all the time. But now, knowing that Emma's body had been hidden in the well in his backyard, the receipt took on a different meaning. Puit had been preparing, or covering up. Detectives pulled property records, satellite images, anything that might show what Pruitt's yard looked like in 2003 versus later. They found a neighbor who'd taken photos at a block party in July of that year. One of the photos showed Pruitt's backyard in the distance. The area around the well looked freshly turned, darker soil contrasting with the rest of the grass. It looked like someone had been digging. The case against Dale Puit was building, but they still needed to find him. It turned out Puit hadn't gone far. After leaving Millbrook in 2005, he'd moved to Ohio, bounced around a few small towns, worked odd jobs under the table, kept his head down. By 2018, his health had started failing. Diabetes, heart problems, early-stage dementia. He'd been placed in a long-term care facility outside Toledo, living under the name Dale Pritchard. A small change, easy to miss, but enough to keep him off the radar. Investigators tracked him down on August 9, 2023. 2 FBI agents and a state police detective arrived at the Sunrise Care Center just after 10 a.m. They asked to speak with Dale Pritchard, and the staff brought them to his room on the second floor. Puit was 73 years old now. He'd lost weight, his face gaunt and pale, his hands shaking slightly from medication or age or both. He was sitting in a chair by the window when the agents walked in. He looked up at them, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then his face changed. Not surprise, recognition, like he'd been expecting this for 20 years. They took him to an interview room at the local police station. He didn't ask for a lawyer right away. Maybe he was too tired. Maybe he didn't think it mattered anymore. The interview was recorded. Video and audio, time-stamped, everything by the book. The lead agent, a woman named Sarah Kellerman, sat across from Puit and laid out the evidence. They'd found Emma Hartley. They'd found her in the well behind his old house. They had DNA confirmation. They had forensic evidence showing she'd suffered trauma before being placed in the well. They had receipts showing he'd purchased materials to cover up a scene. They had witness statements from 2003 saying he'd been acting strangely, refusing to cooperate, shutting investigators out. Puit sat there, staring at the table. He didn't respond. Agent Kellerman kept going. She told him they knew he'd done it. The question wasn't whether, the question was why. And the question was whether he'd tell the truth now, after all this time, or go to his grave with it. Puit looked up. His eyes were wet. He asked for water. They gave it to him. He drank slowly, his hands shaking, and then he started talking. He said he saw Emma that day, June 14th, 2003. He'd been in his garage, and he'd seen her playing in her driveway. He said she looked so small, so alone. He said he didn't plan anything. He didn't know what he was thinking, but he walked over to the edge of his yard and called to her. He told her he had something to show her. A baby rabbit, he said, caught in a box in his backyard. Did she want to see it? Emma had hesitated, but he'd smiled, and she'd followed him. Puit said he led her into his backyard, toward the old well. He said he just wanted to talk to her. He said he was lonely, and she reminded him of his niece who'd died years before. He said he didn't mean to scare her, but when he tried to get her to sit down, she started crying. She said she wanted to go home. She tried to run back toward the front yard. Puit said he grabbed her. He didn't want her to leave. He didn't want her to tell anyone. She screamed, and he put his hand over her mouth, and they struggled. She pulled away, stumbled backward, and her head hit the edge of the well, the old stone edge, rough and sharp. She collapsed. Blood was coming from the back of her head. Puit said he panicked. He checked for a pulse, but he didn't know what he was doing. His hands were shaking. He said her eyes were open, but she wasn't moving. He didn't know if she was unconscious or dead. And then, he said, he made the worst decision of his life. He pulled the wooden cover off the well. It was already rotting, easy to move. He picked Emma up, she was so light, he said, and he dropped her into the well. He heard her body hit the stones on the way down, heard the splash at the bottom. He put the cover back. He went inside, washed his hands, sat on his couch, and waited. He waited for someone to come, waited for the police to knock on his door, to search his yard, to find her. But they didn't. Not that day. Not the next day. By the time they came to interview him, he'd convinced himself he could get away with it. He'd spent the week after Emma disappeared, filling in parts of his yard, spreading gravel and soil over areas that looked disturbed, replacing the boards on top of the well with newer, sturdier ones he'd bought at the hardware store. When the cadaver dogs alerted near his property line in 2003, he'd nearly confessed, but they hadn't found anything. And when they searched his house and came up empty, he knew he was safe. He'd lived with it for 20 years. He said it destroyed him. He said he thought about Emma every single day. He said he wanted to tell someone, but he was too afraid. And then, as time went on, it became easier to just keep quiet, to pretend it hadn't happened, to let the case go cold and fade away. But it hadn't faded. Not for Rachel Hartley. Not for Tom. Not for the investigators who'd never stopped wondering what happened to that little girl. The interview lasted 4 hours. By the end, Puit had confessed to everything. On August 12, 2023, he was formally arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and concealing the death of a child. Given his age and health, he was held without bail in a medical unit of the county jail. The news spread fast. Emma Hartley's case was solved. After 20 years, the person responsible had finally been caught. But for Rachel and Tom, the closure felt hollow. Emma wasn't coming home. She'd been gone the whole time 300 feet away, and no one had known. No one had saved her. Justice was coming, but it was 20 years too late. Dale Puit never went to trial. His lawyer advised him that fighting the charges would be pointless. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession was recorded. A jury would convict him in less than an hour. So on October 3, 2023, in a brief hearing at the county courthouse, Puit entered a guilty plea to all charges: involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and concealing the death of a child. He stood in front of the judge, frail and hunched, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his thinning frame. He answered the judge's questions in a quiet, hoarse voice. Yes, he understood the charges. Yes, he was pleading guilty of his own free will. Yes, he understood he would be sentenced to prison. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for November 14th, 2023. Rachel Hartley attended every court appearance, every preliminary hearing, every status conference, every moment Puit was brought into a courtroom. She sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table, her hands folded in her lap, her face blank. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared at the back of Pruitt's head, willing him to look at her. He never did. Tom Hartley came too, though he sat farther back. His second wife, Angela, came with him for support. Tom looked older than his 54 years. His hair had gone gray. His face was lined with exhaustion. He'd told reporters outside the courthouse that he just wanted it to be over. He wanted Emma to be put to rest. He wanted to stop reliving June 14th, 2003, every single day of his life. The sentencing hearing was held in a packed courtroom. Family members, reporters, investigators, and members of the public who'd followed the case for 20 years all filled the seats. Puit was led in wearing shackles, his hands cuffed in front of him. He moved slowly, shuffling, his eyes on the floor. The judge, a woman named Kathleen Riordan, had been on the bench for 18 years. She'd presided over countless criminal cases, but this one was different. She'd lived in Pennsylvania her whole life. She remembered when Emma Hartley disappeared. She remembered the search parties, the flyers, the fear that had spread through communities across the state. And now, 2 decades later, she was going to sentence the man responsible. Before imposing the sentence, Judge Riordan allowed victim impact statements. Rachel Hartley was the first to speak. She walked to the podium slowly, carrying a folded piece of paper. She didn't look at Puit. She didn't look at anyone. She just unfolded the paper, smoothed it flat, and began to read. Her voice was quiet at first, shaking slightly, but it grew stronger as she continued. She talked about the day Emma was taken, how she'd been folding laundry, how she'd checked on her daughter just minutes before, how everything had been normal until it wasn't. She talked about the first night, when she stayed awake praying that Emma was safe, that whoever had taken her would bring her back. She talked about the weeks that followed, the searches, the interviews, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, had seen her daughter. She talked about the years, 20 of them, 20 years of not knowing, 20 years of false hope every time the phone rang, every time a news story broke about a missing child found alive, 20 years of imagining Emma out there, growing up, maybe not remembering her family, but alive. She said that hope had been the cruelest part, because hope meant she couldn't grieve, couldn't let go, couldn't accept that her daughter was gone. Rachel's voice cracked when she talked about Emma's bedroom. She said she'd kept it exactly the way it was. The stuffed animals on the bed, the crayon drawings on the walls, the clothes still folded in the drawers. She said her marriage hadn't survived the grief. She and Tom had loved each other, but the weight of losing Emma had crushed them. They'd become strangers, trapped in separate silences, each of them drowning alone. She talked about the birthdays, Emma's 8th, her 9th, her 10th, each one marked in private, with a cake Rachel baked and candles she blew out herself. She said she used to wonder what Emma would look like at 15, at 20, at 25, what kind of person she would have become. And then Rachel looked up from the paper. She looked directly at Dale Puit. Her voice was steady now, cold. She said she would never forgive him. She said he had stolen everything. He had stolen Emma's life. He had stolen 20 years of Rachel's life. He had stolen the possibility of peace. And for what? Because he was lonely? Because he panicked? She said his cowardice had destroyed more than just one family. It had destroyed a community's sense of safety. It had destroyed faith that justice could be served. When Rachel finished, she folded the paper, walked back to her seat, and sat down. She didn't cry. She was beyond tears. Tom Hartley spoke next. His statement was shorter, but no less heavy. He thanked the investigators who had never stopped working the case, even when it went cold. He thanked the forensic teams who had handled Emma's remains with care and dignity. And he thanked Kevin Marsh, the well technician, for making the discovery that finally brought Emma home. Tom's voice broke when he said that. Finally brought Emma home. Because for 20 years, she'd been lost. And now, at least, she could rest. Judge Riordan listened to both statements in silence. Then she turned to Dale Puit and asked if he had anything to say. Pruitt's lawyer stood and said his client wished to address the court. Puit rose slowly, gripping the table for support. He looked toward Rachel and Tom, but he couldn't meet their eyes. His voice was barely above a whisper. He said he was sorry. He said he knew that didn't mean anything, didn't change anything, but he wanted them to know. He said he had lived with what he'd done every day for 20 years, and it had destroyed him. He said he deserved whatever punishment he received. Rachel didn't react. She just stared at him, her face stone. Judge Riordan delivered the sentence. 25 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole. Given Pruitt's age and declining health, it was effectively a life sentence. He would die in prison. The courtroom was silent as the judge spoke. When she finished, Puit was led out in shackles. He didn't look back. Emma Hartley was laid to rest on November 22, 2023. It was a private ceremony, held at a small cemetery just outside Millbrook. Only family and a few close friends attended. The casket was small, white, covered in wildflowers. Rachel and Tom stood side by side at the graveside, not touching, but together in their grief. A pastor spoke briefly, but his words felt distant, inadequate. Emma's gravestone was simple. White marble, engraved with her name, her dates, and a single line, Forever 7, finally home. The town of Millbrook held a public memorial the following week. Hundreds of people came. Some had known Emma. Some had searched for her 20 years ago. Some had just grown up hearing her story and wanted to pay their respects. They lit candles, left flowers, stood in silence. Rachel attended, but she didn't stay long. She couldn't handle the crowds, the well-meaning condolences, the strangers who said they understood when they couldn't possibly understand. A few days later, on a cold December morning, Rachel drove to the cemetery alone. She parked, walked through the rows of headstones, and stopped at Emma's grave. She knelt in the frost-covered grass and placed a bouquet of wildflowers, the same kind Emma used to draw with sidewalk chalk all those years ago. Rachel stayed there for a long time, her breath misting in the cold air. She touched the gravestone, traced Emma's name with her fingers, and then, in a voice so quiet it was almost lost to the wind, she whispered, "I never stopped looking for you." Back in Millbrook, the old stone well on Oakwood Drive had been sealed. Concrete poured into the shaft, filled to the top, smoothed over. The property had been sold again. Iris Wendell moved to live with her daughter in another state. She couldn't stay in that house. Not after what had been found there. The well was gone now, buried, silent. But it had finally told its secret. After 20 years, it had given Emma Hartley back to the world. And in doing so, it had become a witness to a truth that no one wanted to accept. That sometimes the answers we search for are closer than we ever imagined. And sometimes they come too late to change anything at all.